He found her tied to a fence post in the middle of a Wyoming winter, both wrists bound, two newborn girls dying in the snow at her feet. No wagon, no supplies, no sign that anyone intended to come back. Someone had left them there on purpose and expected the cold to finish the job. This is the story of what happened next. There are mornings in Wyoming that do not ask permission. They arrive before the sun, before thought, before a man has had the chance to remember who he is or what he has lost. They come with cold so sharp it sits inside the lungs like broken glass, and with a silence so complete that a man could begin to believe the world has always been this quiet, that it has always been this empty. That emptiness is simply the natural condition of things, and he should stop expecting anything different. Wade Harrison had lived inside that silence for a long time. He was 37 years old, and he wore those years the way the land around him wore the winter. Without complaint, without decoration, without any particular interest in being noticed. His face had been shaped by sun and wind, and the kind of solitude that does not soften a man, but does not harden him completely either. It simply makes him still. Still in the way a fence post is still not because it has given up, but because it has decided that standing is enough. That standing for now is everything. The Harrison Ranch spread across 220 acres of high plateau country north of the town of Millhaven in the territory of Wyoming. The land was not generous. It offered grass and wind and rock and sky in roughly equal measure, and in the winter months it offered cold that could kill a man who was careless about it. But the land was his. His father had built the first cabin with his own hands on a July afternoon in 1867, setting each log into place with a kind of reverence, as though the act of building was itself a form of prayer. His mother had planted a garden along the south wall in the spring of 1868, pressing seeds into the frozen ground with her fingers patient as any woman who understands that what you put into the earth comes back to you eventually. Wade had been born in that cabin in 1850, and he had watched it nearly burn to the ground in the winter of 1875. He had been out checking the northern fence line when it started. A lantern, they said later. A lantern knocked over in the horse barn by the weight of a beam that had been weakening for months. And no one had noticed because no one checks every beam, every joint, every small structural failure until it becomes catastrophic. The fire jumped from the barn to the hay storage, and from the hay storage to the cabin itself. And by the time Wade saw the light on the horizon and understood what he was seeing and drove his horse at a full run for the better part of 2 miles, there was nothing left to save. His parents were gone. He buried them in the frozen ground at the foot of the eastern slope, where his mother had always liked to sit in the late afternoon when the light went gold and soft. He made 2 wooden markers and drove them in with a hammer and said no words over the graves because he did not have any. Everything he might have said had been burned with the lantern and the hay and the cabin walls, and what was left when the ash cooled was not grief exactly. It was something older than grief, something that settled in the chest cavity like a stone and stayed there. He rebuilt the cabin alone, smaller than the first one and without the particular care his father had taken with it, but solid enough to keep the winter out. He bought seed and worked the soil and kept what cattle he could through the hard winters and sold them through the lean springs. And he managed the ranch without growing prosperous and without failing entirely, which was its own kind of success in country like this. And he lived alone. For 12 years, he lived alone except for a boy named Billy Cross. Billy had come to the ranch 2 years ago when his father, a ranch hand named Thomas Cross, who had worked seasonally for Wade, died of a rattlesnake bite in the late summer heat. Thomas Cross had no family worth mentioning, no savings, no arrangements made for the boy he was leaving behind. He had simply died the way poor men in the territory died, without warning and without the luxury of a plan, and Billy had been left standing in the dust outside the bunkhouse at the edge of the ranch, 8 years old, and carrying everything he owned in a flour sack. Wade had looked at the boy for a long time, long enough that a different child might have grown uncomfortable and looked away. Billy did not look away. He had dark eyes that were serious beyond his years, the eyes of a person who has learned early that the world will not change its nature to accommodate his feelings about it, and he had held Wade's gaze with a steadiness that was almost unsettling in someone so small. "You can stay," Wade had said finally. "How long?" Billy had asked. "Until something better comes along." Nothing better had come along. 2 years later, Billy slept on a cot in the back room of the cabin and ate at Wade's table, and did his share of the ranch work with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. He was not a talkative child. He did not laugh easily or cry at all, at least not that Wade had ever seen. But he observed. He watched everything and everyone with those serious dark eyes, and he had a quality that Wade had noticed in very few people in his life. He understood when to speak and when to stay quiet. On the morning that changed everything, the temperature had dropped overnight to something that was less a weather condition and more a statement of intent. Wade had been awake since 4 in the morning, as he always was. He had dressed in the dark and drank black coffee standing at the window, watching the pale line of the coming dawn touch the edges of the mountains, and then he had gone out to check the northern fence line, which he did every third day through the winter months because it ran along the property border with the Hargrove land, and the posts up there had a tendency to heave and shift in the frost. He was not expecting company. He never expected company. The sound reached him before the image did. He was moving along the fence line at a slow walk, his horse picking its way carefully through the crusted snow, when something in the air changed. Not the wind, which had been steady and cutting from the northwest all morning. Something underneath the wind. Something that did not belong. At first he thought it was an animal. The high country was full of sounds that could be mistaken for human voices, especially in the cold when the air was thin and distances were unreliable. A fox in distress made a sound that could stop a man's heart. A wounded coyote could sound like something almost human. But as he reined his horse toward the sound and moved through the gap where a section of fence had been torn down entirely, posts snapped clean off at the base, the sound sharpened and separated and became unmistakably what it was. Two voices, two cries, tiny and raw and absolutely human. Wade's hand went to the rifle on his saddle, old instinct. He did not draw it, but the hand went there because that is what hands do when a man does not yet know what he is riding toward. He moved through the broken fence line and around the stand of pine that blocked the sight line, and then he stopped. She was tied to one of the broken fence posts. The ropes went around her wrists, both of them looped twice and knotted tight enough that the hemp had cut through the outer layers of skin. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and black with dried blood along the hem. Her hair had come loose from wherever it had been pinned and hung across her face in matted dark ropes. She was slumped at an angle that suggested she had been standing at some point and then simply stopped, having the strength for it, her weight hanging against the ropes rather than held up by her legs, which were folded under her at a terrible angle. At her feet, wrapped in what appeared to be a single wool shawl that had been torn down the center and distributed between them, lay 2 infants. Newborns are close to it, small enough that each of them could have fit in one hand with room to spare. They were screaming with the full violence of creatures who have only the most basic understanding of their situation, that they are cold and hungry and separated from warmth, and these facts are entirely unacceptable. Wade dismounted. He did not call out, did not announce himself, did not do anything except move. He reached the woman in 6 strides, pulled the knife from his belt, and cut through the rope at her left wrist. She pitched forward immediately, her body having no more reserves for staying upright, and he caught her with his arm across her back and held her weight against his chest while he cut the right wrist free. She was lighter than she should have been, significantly lighter, the kind of lightness that does not come from being small but from having nothing left in reserve. He lowered her to the ground as carefully as he could, and when he shifted her slightly to get a better look at her face, her eyes opened. Gray they were, pale as winter sky. They focused on him with what cost him to see, because it was not relief, it was terror. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who has run out of better options and has resigned themselves to whatever comes next. "Don't," she said. The word was barely a sound, more breath than voice. He waited. "Don't take them." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said in the roughest voice he had, because it was the only one he had, "I am not taking anything. I am helping." He did not know if she heard him. Her eyes went unfocused again, and her head turned to the side, consciousness retreating, like something that did not want to be present for whatever came next. He turned to the infants. He had never held a newborn in his life. He had no framework for it, but he did what seemed necessary. He reached down and gathered them up, one in each arm, as carefully as he knew how, and they went quiet almost immediately. Whether from warmth or exhaustion, or some instinct older than either of those things, they stopped screaming and went still against his chest, their small red faces pressed into the rough canvas of his coat. He looked around at the broken fence, the torn rope still attached to the post, the blood on the snow. No wagon, no supplies, no sign that anyone intended to come back. Someone had brought her here and left her, had tied her to a fence post in the middle of winter with two newborn children at her feet and had ridden away, and had expected the cold to finish the job. Wade's jaw went tight. He adjusted his hold on the infants and looked down at the woman on the ground who was breathing in shallow, uneven pulls, her lips gone pale as bone. He could not carry all three of them on horseback. Not safely, but the cabin was less than 2 miles back and the temperature was still dropping. He made a decision. He wrapped both infants inside his coat and secured them against his body with his belt. Then he lifted the woman and placed her across the saddle, positioning her weight carefully so she would not fall. She did not wake. He took hold of his horse's reins with one hand and walked his free arm pressed against the infants, his body providing what heat he could while the horse carried the woman through the snow. The walk back was the longest of his life. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned down to nothing while he was out, and the small, single room was barely warmer than the air outside. He brought them all in, laid the woman on his bed, which was the only bed, and covered her with every blanket he owned. Then he turned his attention to the infants. He had no crib. He had no supplies for infants of any kind. He had a wooden crate that had been used for storing tools, and he emptied it and lined it with a wool blanket and set it near the hearth. And he worked at building the fire up fast, feeding it until the flames took hold and heat began to move through the room. Billy was asleep on his cot in the back room, or he had been. By the time Wade had the fire going and had turned back to check the woman, the boy was standing in the doorway between the two rooms in his long underwear and socks, looking at the crate near the fire, and the woman in the bed, and the expression on Wade's face. He did not say anything. He looked at the crate where the two infants were now lying breathing in the uneven way of very new things, their fists opening and closing against the air. Then he went to the wood pile and brought more wood without being asked. Wade had spent enough time with Billy Cross to recognize when the boy was doing something important. He let him do it and went back to the woman. Her wrists were in bad condition. The ropes had cut deep, and the cold had done something to the wounds that he had seen once before in a ranch hand who had been caught in a storm, a kind of mottled, waxy look to the skin around the damage that meant the tissue had been pushed close to its limit. He heated water in the pot over the fire and cleaned the wounds as carefully as his large, rough hands allowed, which was not very carefully, but it was what he had. He worked through the night. He changed the cloth strips he used for bandages when they soaked through. He managed to get warm broth between her lips twice in the hours when she surfaced briefly into something approaching consciousness, her eyes open and confused and frightened in the firelight. He checked the infants every hour, making sure they were breathing, making sure the temperature near the hearth was neither too high nor too low. Billy kept watch over the infants without being asked to. He sat in the chair near the crate and did not sleep, which was the kind of thing that only becomes remarkable when you stop to consider that the boy was 8 years old and had no particular reason to stay awake, except that he had decided it was necessary. By the time the sky lightened outside the single window, the woman's color had improved marginally. The terrible blue at her lips had faded. Her breathing had steadied into something less like a machine failing and more like a person resting. The infant slept. Wade sat in the other chair with his head against the wall and allowed himself to close his eyes for the first time in 20 hours. He still did not know her name. He still did not know who had done this. But he knew that if anyone came looking for her, they would have to go through him first. He had not made any decision about this. It had simply arrived in him, fully formed the way convictions sometimes do not, through reasoning, but through something older and less negotiable. 3 days passed. On the fourth morning, Wade woke in his chair to find the woman sitting up in his bed with her back against the wall watching him. She had the bandages on her wrists and the bruising around her eyes from what he suspected had been a hard fall at some point, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on a person's face in a long time. It was the expression of someone trying to calculate whether they are safe. "You're awake," he said. "Where am I?" "My ranch, about 5 miles north of Millhaven." "Wyoming." Not a question. Something settling. "Yes." She exhaled. She looked toward the crate near the fire. The two infants were sleeping, breathing in the synchronized way they had developed over the past 4 days, as though they had already agreed on a rhythm. "They're alive," he said. "Healthy. They eat well." A tear moved down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her bandaged wrist, a quick, efficient gesture, like someone who has practice with not letting tears become a habit. "My name is Clara," she said. "Clara Bennett. I was married to Arthur Hargrove." He told her his name. They sat in silence for a moment the way strangers do when they are deciding how much of themselves to offer. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He thought about the answer. "Why wouldn't I? Most people wouldn't have." "I'm not most people." She looked at him, then really looked with those pale gray eyes that had stopped being frightened and become something more considered. She seemed to be assessing him the way a person assesses terrain, looking for the solid ground, the places where weight can be put. Her story came out over the following days in portions offered between the small daily tasks of a cabin occupied by 4 people, instead of 2. She would be nursing one of the infants and say a sentence or two, and then fall quiet for an hour. She would be sitting by the window in the afternoon light and speak a paragraph as though reading from something she had been carrying inside herself for months, and then close the page. She had come from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Her father was a farmer who had broken his leg the winter before and could no longer work the way he once could. The medical bills had been significant. The choice between medicine and food had become a real one, the kind of choice that families in tight circumstances learn to look directly in the face. A woman in their community had heard of an arrangement, a matching service, they called it, though the word felt clinical for what it actually was, a system by which men in the Western territories who needed wives and women in the Eastern states who needed options could find their way to each other through correspondence. The man was named Arthur Hargrove, a rancher, a widower, 41 years old, looking for a capable woman to manage his household. Clara had been 21 at the time. She had written him a letter that was careful and honest, which was the only kind of letter she knew how to write. She had described herself without flattery, plain in appearance, capable in housework, and cooking, educated enough to keep accounts and read to children if there were any, and willing to work. She had told him about her father. He had written back. They had exchanged 4 letters over the course of 3 months. He was not warm in his writing, but he was direct, which she had respected. He had offered terms that were reasonable. She had accepted. She had arrived in Millhaven on a September afternoon 9 months ago now. Arthur Hargrove had met her at the station with a wagon and a handshake and no particular expression on his face. He was older than she had imagined and quieter, and the house was larger than she had expected, and his family was nothing like what she had prepared herself for. The Hargroves were old Wyoming money, the kind that had been there long enough to believe the territory owed them something. Franklin, the eldest brother, ran the family's collective business interests. There were 3 other brothers and a collection of cousins and their wives, and they had all looked at Clara the day she arrived with the same expression, the expression of people assessing whether a purchase has been worth the cost. The marriage to Arthur was not cruel. That was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about it. He was distant, and he expected things to be done in certain ways that he did not bother to explain, and he had almost no interest in her as a person rather than a function. But he did not hurt her. The pregnancy had changed things. When the midwife confirmed that she was carrying twins, she had felt something that was partly joy and partly dread, and the dread had been well-founded. Twins in the Hargrove family's view were 2 sets of expenses, 2 mouths, 2 futures to provide for, and when the midwife further confirmed that both children appeared to be girls, the atmosphere in the house shifted in a way that had no drama in it, nothing loud or obvious. It was quieter than that. It was the quiet of a family revising its opinion. Arthur went to Cheyenne on business in early winter. He did not come back. A rider arrived instead, carrying the kind of news that riders carry when they have been paid to carry the worst of it. Arthur Hargrove had been shot in the back during a card game dispute in a saloon on the eastern edge of the city. He had died before anyone thought to send for a doctor. The letter from Franklin had arrived 3 days after the birth. One sentence, essentially. She had 1 day to leave the house. When she had refused, when she had asked for more time, when she had pointed out that she had given birth 4 days ago and her children were premature and fragile, and she was not physically capable of leaving, they had not argued with her. They had simply waited until dark and come for her. She described the night in the same flat, careful voice she used for everything else. The hands that took hold of her arms, the walk across the frozen ground in her nightgown, the post and the rope, the sound of her children crying behind her, the sound of horses moving away. They said the cold would take care of it, she said. She was looking at the fire. They said by morning no one would be asking questions. Wade had been holding a cup of coffee. He had not been aware that his hand had tightened around it until he felt the heat through the ceramic. He set the cup down carefully. They left you to die. Yes. And the children? Yes. He did not say anything for a long time. The fire made its sounds. Ruth, the quieter of the two girls, had her eyes open in the crate and was looking up at the ceiling with that solemn, absolute focus she brought to everything. Billy was outside doing the afternoon chores which he had taken on as his own responsibility without being asked. "They won't come here," Wade said. Clara looked at him sharply. "How do you know?" "Because if they do, they'll regret it." There was something in his voice that was not a threat exactly. It was simpler than a threat. It was a statement of condition, the way a man tells you that a certain bridge will hold two horses or it won't, based on his knowledge of the bridge and not any desire to argue about it. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the fire. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. You don't owe me anything." "I do." He shook his head slightly. "You're safe. That's enough." But even as he said it, he was already wondering how true it was. Because somewhere in the particular quiet of that afternoon, watching the light move across her face while she looked at the daughters who had nearly died in the snow with her, something had shifted in him. Something he had not felt in years had stirred back into motion the way a creek that has been frozen solid for the whole of winter will begin to move again under the surface before the ice shows any sign of breaking. You cannot hear it, but it is happening. He was not ready to name it yet. He was not sure he would ever be ready to name it. But it was there. The first week passed in the practical language of shared space. She cooked when she was strong enough, which was not always, but she worked at it with a steady determination that he recognized as something deeper than effort. It was the determination of someone who has decided that she will not be a burden, who has decided this so completely that it functions as a kind of armor. She moved through the small cabin with the careful attention of a guest who knows she is on borrowed ground and wants to leave it better than she found it. He did his best to stay out of her way, which in a one-room cabin is not entirely possible, but there is a way of occupying space that does not press on the people around you. And Wade had developed this skill over years of living alone. He worked outside more than usual. He found tasks that took him to the far edges of the property and brought him back before dark. Billy was the one who moved between them naturally. On the third morning, Billy sat down at the table across from Clara while she was nursing Ruth and said without preamble, "Do you know how to read?" "I do," she said. "Why?" "Wade has books, but he never reads them out loud." Clara looked at Wade, who was standing at the window with his back to the room. "Does he not like to read aloud?" Billy considered this. "He doesn't talk much, about anything." That evening after supper, Clara picked up the worn copy of a book from the shelf above the fireplace and asked Billy if he wanted to hear a story. He said yes with a gravity that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this for some time. She read for an hour and Billy listened without moving, and Wade sat in the corner working on a piece of leather that needed oiling. He told himself he was not listening. He was listening. On the fifth day, Clara was strong enough to come outside for a short time. She stood in the cold with her face turned up to the pale winter sun, eyes closed, and Wade saw something happen to her expression that he did not have a word for. It was the look of someone returning to themselves after a long absence. "The mountains," she said without opening her eyes. "They're always there. In Pennsylvania, we don't have mountains like this. We have hills, things that apologize for being large." She opened her eyes and looked at the long line of peaks against the blue sky. These don't apologize. He had not thought about the mountains in that way before. He looked at them now, trying to see what she was seeing. "No," he agreed, "they don't." She turned and looked at the cabin, the small, dark structure in the white landscape, the single window with its dim glow. "You built this alone." "Rebuilt. My father built the first one." She waited. "Fire," he said, 12 years ago. She did not press for more. She had the quality he was beginning to notice of knowing when to wait. It was not politeness exactly. It was more like respect, the recognition that some things are offered, not extracted. That night after Billy had gone to bed, and after Grace and Ruth had been fed and settled, Wade told her the rest of it. Not because he had planned to, but because the cabin was quiet and the fire was low, and she was sitting across from him with her hands folded in her lap, and it seemed to him that she was the kind of person you could tell the truth to without worrying about what she would do with it. He told her about riding home and seeing the light on the horizon, about the last 2 miles which had felt like running through water, about the stillness of the ash, about the wooden markers in the frozen ground. He told her about the years since, the neighbors who had circled, the solitude he had chosen not entirely by preference, but partly by necessity and partly because he had forgotten somewhere along the way what it felt like to need something that land and cattle could not provide. Did you want to leave? She asked. Every day for the first 5 years. What stopped you? He was quiet for a moment. This land is all I have left of them. Every post my father set, every corner of the garden my mother planted. He looked at his hands. Leaving would have meant losing them all over again. Clara was quiet. I understand that, she said eventually. You lost something too. I lost the possibility of something. I married a man I didn't know and came 2,000 miles for a life I couldn't see yet. And when he died, what I lost was not him exactly. It was the chance. She paused. The chance that it might have become something real. Wade looked at her. It can still become something real. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the sleeping girls. Maybe, she said, if they let it. On the 8th day after Clara's arrival, Wade rode into Millhaven for supplies. It was a trip he could not put off any longer. The flour was gone. The salt was low. The cloth he had been using for bandaging was not sufficient for what Clara needed once the girls were old enough to require proper wrapping for their early weeks. He rode in with a list in his coat pocket and his hat pulled down and the particular expression he wore in town that said without words that he was not there for conversation. Millhaven was not a large place. It had a trading post that doubled as a general store, a blacksmith, a boarding house run by a woman named Dorothy Ellis, a saloon and a collection of houses that housed the approximately 200 people who had chosen this particular patch of the territory to try to build something lasting. Wade knew some of these people by name, and all of them by sight, and he expected as he loaded supplies onto his horse to conduct his business without incident. He had underestimated how quickly word travels in a small town. He was tying off the last of the supply bags when the shopkeeper leaned across the counter and said with the careful tone of someone delivering information they expect to be unpopular, "The Hargroves have been asking about you." Wade looked at him. Asking what? Everything. How long you have been having a woman at the ranch. Whether she came willingly. Whether there are children. The shopkeeper paused. And whether you and she have any kind of legal arrangement. Wade said nothing. I am just telling you, the shopkeeper said. They have money. And when people with money start asking questions about things that could be embarrassing, they usually have a purpose. Wade picked up his goods. He was halfway to the door when the shopkeeper said one more thing quietly as though testing whether the walls had ears. There is also talk that they are going to the territorial judge, saying you are holding the widow against her will. Wade stopped walking. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked out. He was untying his horse outside when a voice called to him from across the mud street. He turned. A woman was standing in the doorway of the boarding house, middle-aged with the kind of face that does not broadcast its history, but has had one. She was looking at him with an expression that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, but very direct. Mr. Harrison, she said, I am Dorothy Ellis. I run the boarding house. I would like to speak with you if you have a moment. He crossed the street. She brought him inside to a small sitting room off the entrance hall and offered him coffee, which he declined, and then sat across from him with her hands folded on the table and said the following. She had known Clara Bennett before the girl had married Arthur Hargrove. She had processed the correspondence, had been the person in Millhaven who received the matching services communications and forwarded them to the appropriate parties, and she had met Clara on the day the girl arrived at the station in September. She was not what the Hargroves expected, Dorothy said. They expected someone grateful and quiet and willing to make herself small. She was grateful and quiet, but she was not small. She had a mind, and she used it, and they did not like that. Wade listened. What they did to her, Dorothy continued, is known, not spoken of, because the Hargroves are the Hargroves, but known. She looked at him steadily. And what you did for her is also known. And I want you to know that not everyone in this town is afraid of the Hargrove name. She reached into the pocket of her apron and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. That is the name and address of a lawyer in Cheyenne. His name is Elias Porter. He does not owe the Hargroves anything, and he is not afraid of their money. If it comes to a legal fight, and I believe it will, you should contact him. Wade looked at the paper. Then he picked it up and put it in his coat pocket. Why are you telling me this? Dorothy looked at him for a moment. Because I have watched too many women in this territory disappear into circumstances they did not choose, and then disappear again when those circumstances became inconvenient for the men around them. And because someone needs to say at least once that it is enough, that it will not happen again, not if I can do anything about it. She folded her hands again. The Hargroves are going to move against you legally. I suspect sooner than you think because they need this resolved before too many people hear Clara's version of events. If you are going to fight them, you need to be ready. Wade stood. He held her gaze. I'll be ready. Good. She glanced toward the door. Be careful going home, Mr. Harrison. The road north has been watched. When he arrived at the ranch, Clara was on the porch. She had wrapped herself in his largest coat, which hung to her knees, and she was holding both girls at once, one in the crook of each arm, and she was looking down the trail toward the south with an expression that told him she had been standing there for a while. She saw his face before he said a word. What happened? She said, not a question. He brought the horse in and came to the porch and told her. All of it. The shopkeeper's warning. Dorothy Ellis, the lawyer's name. The accusations being prepared. She listened without interrupting the way she always listened, and when he was done, she was quiet for a long moment. The girls were asleep in her arms, impossible, as that seemed given the cold, their faces peaceful against her chest. They are going to say you took me against my will, she said. Yes. That you are holding me here under some kind of threat. Yes. She looked down at Grace, whose small face was turned up to the pale sky. They will make you the villain. They will try. They have money and lawyers and relationships with the court, and you have a ranch and a questionable reputation as a recluse. She looked at him. I am sorry, I did not mean for this to come down on you. It hasn't come down on anyone yet, he said, and when it does, we'll deal with it. She shook her head slightly. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the plateau and took her dark hair with it, pulling it sideways across her face, and she could not push it back with her hands full, so she just let it go. I am not a woman who accepts charity easily, she said. I want you to know that. I did not write those letters and ride 2,000 miles to be someone's problem to solve. I came here to work, to be useful, to make something. She paused. And now I am standing in your coat on your porch with your supplies in the saddlebags, and I have brought you nothing but trouble. Wade stepped off onto the porch so they were at the same level. You came here because you had a contract, he said. Arthur Hargrove died. His family threw you out. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a person who ended up in a situation you did not make and do not deserve, and there is a difference. She was quiet. And you brought the girls, he said. Something shifted in her expression. He had not planned to say that. He was not a man who said things he had not planned as a rule. But it was simply true, and it seemed to him that truth, when it is simple enough, deserves to be spoken. They are not a bargaining chip, she said. I know. I am saying that whatever trouble you think you brought with you, you also brought them, and they are worth it. Clara looked down at the sleeping faces in her arms. Her throat moved. You have known them for 8 days, she said softly. It doesn't take long, Wade said. With some things, it doesn't take long. Billy appeared around the side of the cabin from the direction of the barn, carrying a bucket, and looked at the two of them on the porch with an expression that was entirely too composed for a child his age. Supper's going to be late if no one starts it, he said and disappeared inside. Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh. Wade looked at the door Billy had gone through and felt something he had not felt in years settle into the exact shape of a thing he recognized but had no practice naming. The girls woke almost simultaneously as they usually did and began making their demands known, and Clara went inside to feed them, and Wade unsaddled his horse and put up the supplies. And when he came in, the cabin was warm, and Billy was setting the table, and the smell of something cooking was filling the single room with the particular authority of domesticity, which does not ask permission and does not wait to be invited. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. The paper with the lawyer's name was still in his pocket. Outside, the sun was going down behind the mountains, and the temperature was already falling toward something that would require every bit of preparation they had. And somewhere south of here, on a ranch that bore a name that had once meant something, a man named Franklin Hargrove was making plans. Wade knew it the way he knew when weather was coming. Not through evidence exactly, but through the particular quality of the air. The way things go still before they move. They had time, he thought. Not much, but some. He moved to the fire and stood beside it, letting the heat work into his hands, and listened to the sound of the cabin around him. 2 infants, 1 boy, 1 woman, all the noise and weight of lives being lived in close proximity. He had thought he was used to the quiet. He was learning how wrong that was. The snow came back on the 10th day. It came without announcement the way Wyoming weather often does, as though the sky had been considering it for some time and had simply decided this was the moment. By morning, the trail south toward Millhaven had disappeared under 8 inches of new accumulation, And by afternoon, it was 12, and by the time the light failed, it was clear that they were not going anywhere for a while. Wade had expected this to be a problem. It was not a problem. Or rather, it was not the kind of problem he had anticipated, which was the problem of two people who do not know each other being forced into close quarters with no means of escape. That problem, as it turned out, was smaller than the practical ones. There were cattle to be fed and checked. There was wood to be split and carried. There were two infants who required feeding every few hours with the absolute democratic indifference of newborns who do not care about weather conditions or social awkwardness, or the fact that the man in the cabin has not shared this much space with another adult in over a decade. Clara managed the infants with a focus that was almost military. She had developed a system in the 2 weeks since her arrival, a rotation of feeding times and sleeping arrangements, and the specific positions in which Grace and Ruth preferred to be held, which were completely different from each other. Grace wanted to be upright against a shoulder, her head tipped to the side, looking out at the room as though attending a lecture. Ruth preferred to be cradled low, her face turned inward toward the warmth of the body, holding her private and self-contained, in a way that seemed improbable in something so small. Billy had, without ceremony or discussion, appointed himself official holder of whichever infant was not being fed. He would sit in the chair by the fire with one of the girls balanced carefully in his arms and stare at her with his serious, dark eyes, and occasionally he would say something to her in a low voice that was too quiet for Wade to hear. Whatever he said, it seemed to work. Ruth in particular went calm in Billy's arms in a way that she did not immediately go calm for Wade, which Wade noticed and found mildly humbling. He did not have extensive experience being humbled by 8-year-olds. Clara taught him, not intentionally, not in any formal sense, but she had a way of showing him things by doing them that was more effective than instruction. She showed him how to wrap the girls in a way that kept them secure without restricting their breathing. She showed him which cry meant hunger, and which meant discomfort, and which was simply the sound of being new to the world and finding it bewildering. She showed him without making a lesson of it that infants are not as fragile as they appear, and not as durable as you might hope, and that the territory between those two facts is where a caregiver lives most of the time. He showed her things too. He showed her the barn and the horses and the particular temperament of the old gray mare, who would tolerate being handled by strangers if you approached her from the left side and let her smell your hand first. He showed her how to read the sky for incoming weather, the specific colors and cloud formations that meant different things in different seasons. He showed her where the fence line ran and why the northern section needed more attention than the rest. He did not explain why he was showing her these things. She did not ask. But there was a logic to it that neither of them articulated. He was showing her the shape of the place, and she was learning it, and the learning was a kind of investment, the investment of someone who expects to be somewhere for a while. Billy watched all of this with the patient attention of someone reading a story he has been waiting to see the ending of. One afternoon toward the end of the second week, Wade was in the barn repairing a section of tack when he heard Clara's voice from the direction of the fence. He went to the barn door and so looked out. She was standing at the edge of the yard in the borrowed coat that had become hers by default, and she was looking at the snow-covered plateau with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not fear. It was not calculation. It was something open, something that did not have its defenses up, and it lasted only a moment before she must have sensed him watching, and it closed again. He went back to the tack. That evening, while Billy was doing his schoolwork at the table and the girls were asleep, Clara sat down across from Wade with a cup of coffee and said without preamble, "Tell me about your parents." He looked at her. "You told me about the fire," she said, "but you told me about the ending. Tell me about before." He did not often talk about before. Before had always seemed like a place that existed in a closed room, not locked, but with a door he had learned not to open because the things inside it were only painful to look at. But she was asking with the kind of directness that does not have manipulation in it, and he found to his own surprise that the door opened without much resistance. He told her about his father, a quiet man not unlike himself who had the gift of knowing exactly how much effort a thing required and applying precisely that amount, never more, never less. A man who measured his words the same way he measured nails. You used what you needed and wasted none. He told her about his mother, who was the opposite of quiet, who had sung while she worked, not particularly well, but with the complete lack of self-consciousness of someone who sings for her own pleasure and not for any audience, who had planted her garden with a conviction that seeds placed in frozen ground in March would become tomatoes in August, which had always seemed to Wade like a form of faith that bordered on the irrational, and which had always proven correct. Clara listened. She had both hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face, and she did not offer sympathy or make sounds of understanding which he appreciated. She simply listened. "She must have loved this place," Clara said when he stopped. "She did, even when it was brutal. She used to say that land that gives easily is land that doesn't trust you yet." Clara smiled. It was the first complete smile he had seen from her, without qualification or restraint. It changed her face in a way that caught him unprepared. "My mother said something similar about bread," she said, "that if it rose too easily, it wasn't worth eating." He found himself almost smiling back. "Your turn," he said. She looked down at her coffee. She told him about Lancaster, about a childhood that had been genuinely happy in the way that poor childhoods sometimes are before the weight of adult circumstance settles onto them. About a father who read to her every evening, whatever books they could borrow or trade for, and who had the specific gift of making every story seem like it was happening in the room with you. About a mother who died when Claire was 14, of a fever that came and went in a week, and about the particular shape that loss makes in a family when the person who was holding it together is suddenly gone. She told him about the decision to answer the correspondence advertisement, the way she had sat with the paper in her hands for 2 hours before picking up a pen, the feeling of the train moving west each mile adding itself to the distance between her and everything she knew. "Were you frightened?" he asked. "Every day, but I had decided it was worth being frightened." He thought about that. What made it worth it? She looked at the sleeping girls. "I had a plan, I had a contract, I had a clear set of expectations." She paused. "Everything that has happened since has been outside the plan. That is generally how life works." "I know." She looked at him. "I'm just learning to make my peace with it." Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant water, and the fire shifted and settled. And Billy looked up from his schoolwork long enough to study both of them with those appraising dark eyes and then look back down without comment. On the 17th night, Grace got sick. It began around midnight with a change in her crying. Wade had learned by this point to distinguish the different qualities of infant distress, and what he heard through the thin wall between the rooms was not the sound of hunger or discomfort. It was higher and sharper, and had an urgency underneath it that was different from the usual. The urgency of a small body working very hard at something it should not have to work at. He was up before Clara called his name. She was already holding Grace when he came through the doorway, and even in the low firelight he could see it. The girl's face was flushed. Her small fists were clenched, and her legs were pulling up toward her body in the rhythmic, involuntary way of something in pain. When Clara pressed her lips to Grace's forehead, as Wade had seen her do 100 times in the past 2 weeks, the expression on Clara's face changed in a way that bypassed every composure she had built and went directly to the animal truth underneath. "She's burning," Clara said. Wade looked at the window. Outside, the storm that had been building all day was at its worst. The snow was not falling so much as moving sideways, driven by wind that had been gusting to something near violent since sundown. The road to Millhaven, which had been questionable in the best conditions for the past week, was not a road anymore. It was a white absence where a road had once been. There was no doctor within reach. This was a fact he absorbed and set aside because facts that cannot be changed are not productive objects for attention. "What do we do?" he said. She was already doing it. She was moving to the water bucket, testing the temperature, moving to the fire, adjusting the pot. She spoke as she worked in short, precise sentences, telling him what she needed. Water heated to a specific temperature, not boiling. Clean cloth. More wood on the fire to raise the room temperature without making it too hot. Ruth moved to the far side of the crate, away from the heat bundled more warmly since they could not keep the room cool. Wade did each of these things as she named them. He did them without asking why, because the why was evident and the doing was what was required. He heated the water to the degree she described. He found clean cloth. He added wood with the calibration she specified, opening the cabin door briefly to check the temperature of the room with his bare arm, which was a crude measure but the only one they had. Billy appeared in the doorway. Neither Wade nor Clara had asked him to wake up. He had simply woken. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the situation with those dark eyes, and then crossed to the crate and sat beside it with his hand resting on the edge near Ruth, who was awake and making soft, uncertain sounds. "I have her," Billy said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Ruth. The next 4 hours were the longest Wade had spent since the night of the fire. Clara worked with a focus that he understood finally and completely as the truest measure of a person. Not what they do when things are easy. What they do when nothing is working and the tools are inadequate and the outcome is uncertain and there is no one coming to help. She did not cry. She did not stop moving. She held Grace against her chest and applied the warm cloths with patient repetition, and she spoke to the girl in a low, continuous voice that was not quite language and not quite song, some combination of the two that was specifically for Grace and no one else. Wade sat beside her on the floor. He did not know how to help in the way Clara was helping. His hands were too large for the task. His knowledge of infant illness was essentially non-existent. But he could be present, which he was, and he could be steady, which he was. And when Clara's hands began to tremble somewhere around the third hour, not from fear, but from the sustained physical effort of holding and wrapping and unwrapping and holding again, he reached over and took the warm cloth from her and pressed it to Grace's forehead himself. Clara looked at him. He kept his eyes on Grace. He pressed the cloth carefully the way she had shown him, evenly and not too firmly, and he said nothing. Toward 4 in the morning, something shifted. Grace's body unclenched slightly. The rhythmic pulling of her legs slowed and stopped. The quality of her crying changed again, going from that alarming high note back to something lower and more ordinary. Clara pressed her lips to Grace's forehead and stayed there for a long moment. And when she pulled back, the expression on her face was the most unguarded thing Wade had seen in the weeks since he had found her at the fence post. "She's coming down," Clara said. Wade let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some portion of the night. He sat back against the wall. Clara sat back beside him, Grace still against her chest, and they both simply stayed there on the floor with their backs against the wall, and the firelight moving over them, and the sound of the storm beginning very slowly to ease. After a long time, Clara said, "Thank you. I didn't do anything. You stayed." She paused. Most people, when they don't know what to do, they leave. Or they fill the air with noise so no one notices they're useless. You stayed, and you were quiet, and you did the things I asked, and you kept the room steady. She shifted Grace slightly. That was not nothing. He did not answer. She looked at him. In the low firelight, with her hair loose and her face hollowed by exhaustion and relief, she looked like someone he had known for a long time. Not because he had known her for a long time, but because the kind of hours they had just passed together have a way of compressing the distance between people into something that normal time cannot achieve. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why did you take us in the real reason, not the one where you say it was the right thing to do, because I know it was the right thing to do. But why did you do it when so many people would have decided it was not their business?" He was quiet for a while. "When my parents died," he said finally, "the people who could have helped didn't. They had reasons. They were too busy. They had their own problems. It wasn't their business." He looked at the fire. "I decided a long time ago that I was not going to be one of those people. That if something was in front of me that needed to be done, I was going to do it and not calculate the cost first." She was quiet. "That is a harder way to live," she said. "It is. But you chose it anyway." "I did." Ruth made a small sound from the crate, and Billy, who had been asleep sitting up with his hand still on the edge of the wood, opened his eyes and adjusted his position without fully waking, in the specific way of someone who has learned to rest lightly. "He's a good boy," Clara said softly. "He is. You are good for him. He is good for me." Grace shifted and settled and went fully quiet. The storm outside had dropped to almost nothing. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to soften the darkness at the edges of the window. Wade did not move. Clara did not move. They sat on the floor of the cabin with their backs against the wall and their shoulders almost touching, and neither of them suggested that they should get up, because this particular moment had a weight to it that neither of them wanted to disturb before it was ready. Eventually, Clara's head tipped slightly sideways and came to rest against his shoulder. She was asleep almost immediately. He stayed exactly as he was. He did not move. He looked at the window going from gray to pale gold as the sun came up behind the clouds, and he held the weight of her head on his shoulder with the same care he would have given to something he was afraid to break. And he thought about the mornings he had watched alone from this same cabin, and he thought about the particular difference of this one. He did not name it, but he understood it. The 3 days that followed Grace's fever were different, not dramatically, not in ways that would have been obvious to an outside observer, but in the specific register of two people who have passed through something together and come out knowing each other better than they did before the change was clear. Clara was less careful with him. That was the truest way to describe it. She had been careful before in the way that a guest is careful, precise, contained, occupying exactly the space she had been offered and not reaching beyond it. Now she was somewhat less precise. She left her book open on the table when she stepped away from it. She asked him opinions about things, not just practical things, but other things, whether she thought the eastern sky that morning looked like rain or like another clear day, which of the two horses she should try to ride first when the snow cleared enough for riding. He answered the questions. He had not known until she began asking that he had opinions about these things. He had thought of himself as a man without particular preferences about the smaller categories of daily life. He was learning this was not entirely accurate. Billy had noticed the change before either of them acknowledged it. On the fourth morning after the fever, he came in from the barn with a bucket of water and set it down and looked at Wade and said with the absolute absence of tact that is the exclusive property of children, "Are you going to ask her to stay?" Wade looked at him. "Mind your business," he said. "I am minding my business," Billy said. "This is my house too," which was an argument Wade could not immediately counter. So he said nothing, and Billy took this as the particular form of agreement that silence often represents. The snow began to soften in the way that late winter snow softens not all at once, but in patches, the south-facing slopes going first the trail to Millhaven becoming visible again in sections. The world outside the cabin, which had been sealed and complete for the better part of 3 weeks, began to open at its edges. On the morning the trail was clearly passable again, Wade stood at the window and looked south and thought about Dorothy Ellis and the paper in his coat pocket. He thought about Franklin Hargrove. He thought about the plans that were almost certainly being made, the lawyers and the judges, and the particular machinery of power that grinds slowly and then all at once. Clara came to stand beside him. She looked where he was looking. "It's time," she said. "Yes. What happens next?" He had been thinking about this. He turned away from the window and looked at her, and he said what he had been working his way toward for several days. Dorothy Ellis said there are people in Millhaven who will testify about what the Hargroves did, and there is a lawyer in Cheyenne who will take the case. But before any of that, we need to understand what they are planning so we can be ready for it. "You're going into town. Tomorrow." She held his gaze. "Be careful." "I will. I mean it, Wade." She said his name carefully, the way she always did, like she was still deciding whether she had the right to use it without the distance of formality. "They are not above having something happen on a road." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about what it meant that she had said his name. "I know." He paused at the door before going out to the barn. "Clara." She turned. "Whatever they plan to do," he said, "they are going to find that the ground has shifted. They are not dealing with a woman alone anymore." She looked at him for a longer time. Her expression did one of the things it did sometimes, where something opened behind her eyes and then closed again before he could fully read it. "No," she said quietly, "I suppose I'm not." He rode into Millhaven the following morning in clear, cold air. The trail was rough but passable, the snow crusted and uneven under his horse's hooves, the mountains standing sharp and white against the sky that had gone a deep, undiluted blue after the weeks of cloud. Wade rode with his coat buttoned to the collar and his rifle across the saddle, not because he expected trouble on the road, but because the road had been watched before and he saw no reason to revise his caution. The town was quiet in the way of frontier towns, after a long snow, people moving between buildings, quickly getting the business done, not lingering. He tied his horse outside the general store and went in. The shopkeeper was serving another customer and did not acknowledge him immediately. When the other customer left, the shopkeeper came to the counter with an expression that sat between cautious and apologetic. "The Hargroves," Wade said, "still asking questions." The shopkeeper glanced toward the window as though checking who might be walking past. "Franklin Hargrove was here 4 days ago. He asked me specifically what you had been buying. How much flour, how much salt, whether your purchases suggested more people on the ranch than usual." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific, but he's smart enough to count." Wade bought what he needed. He was tying the supplies when he heard the boarding house door open across the street, and Dorothy Ellis came out onto the step and looked at him with a directness that said she had been watching for him. He crossed the street. Inside, she did not offer coffee this time. She sat him down and sat down herself and folded her hands on the table and spoke without preamble. "I have been doing some inquiring," she said, "into the Hargrove family's financial situation." He waited. "Arthur Hargrove had debts," Dorothy said. "Significant ones. The card games in Cheyenne were not occasional entertainment. They were a serious problem. He borrowed money from 3 different men to cover his losses over the past 2 years, and none of that money has been repaid." She looked at Wade steadily. Franklin knows about the debts. He has been managing them quietly, trying to keep them from becoming public knowledge. Because if the creditors push the matter through the court, a significant portion of the Hargrove land would need to be sold to satisfy what is owed. Wade considered this. If Clara and the girls are recognized as having rights under the marriage contract, he said then Arthur's estate would be divided. Yes, and the portion that might have been sold quietly to cover the debts would instead go to Clara and her daughters, which would make the debt problem very much public and very much worse. Dorothy paused. Franklin is not simply trying to reclaim family honor. He is trying to preserve his family's solvency. Clara and those two girls represent, from his perspective, a direct financial threat. He's not just a cruel man, he's a frightened one. Frightened men are more dangerous than cruel ones, Dorothy said. Cruelty has limits. Fear doesn't. She reached into the folds of her apron and placed something on the table between them. Not the lawyer's name this time. A small packet of documents folded and sealed with a piece of twine. Arthur Hargrove sent these to me before he died, she said. I believe he knew he was in trouble, though I do not think he knew it was as serious as it turned out to be. He asked me to hold them in case anything happened to him. She laid her hand flat on the packet. There is a letter in here addressed to Clara. There is a deed to a parcel of land he held in his own name, separated from the family holdings, which he transferred into her name before his death. And there is a signed statement from him acknowledging the legitimacy of the marriage contract and his obligation under it. Wade looked at the documents. Does Franklin know these exist? He knows Arthur had the deed drawn up. He does not know Arthur sent these to me. He has been operating on the assumption that he destroyed everything relevant when he cleared out Arthur's private papers. Dorothy pushed the packet slightly toward Wade. He was wrong. Wade picked up the documents. They had the specific weight of things that matter, which is not physical, but is somehow felt anyway. There is something else, Dorothy said. Something I should have told you sooner, and for which I owe both of you an apology. She was quiet for a moment. I was the one who forwarded the matching services correspondence to Arthur Hargrove. I was the one who processed the letters and arranged the introductions. She looked at the table. I knew the family. I had seen how they treated Arthur's first wife before she died. I should have done more to warn Clara before she came. I chose to believe that people could change, and I was wrong, and a young woman and her children nearly died for my failure to act on what I knew. The room was quiet. You're acting now, Wade said. Too late. Better late than the alternative. She looked at him. You are a less complicated person than most, Mr. Harrison. I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. He stood and put the documents inside his coat. I will be in touch with Mr. Porter in Cheyenne this week, he said. I expect the Hargroves will move quickly once the road is fully clear. I would like to be ready before they do. I will have people ready to speak, Dorothy said. I promise you that. He was halfway to the door when she said one more thing. He turned. Franklin Hargrove has hired a private investigator from Cheyenne. His job is to build a case that you are holding Clara against her will. He has been watching your property. He has been asking people who know you whether you are the kind of man who might take advantage of a vulnerable woman. She met his eyes. I think you should know that everyone I am aware of who was asked that question gave the same answer, which was that you are, if anything, the least likely person in this territory to take advantage of anyone. A faint smile moved across her face. The words used most often were too stubborn and too damn honest. He put his hat back on. I'll take that. 3 days later they came. Not 4 men this time. Wade counted 8 horses on the trail before they were close enough for him to identify riders. He was in the barn working on a broken wheel spoke when he heard them, and he set down the tools with the specific, unhurried movement of a man who has been expecting something and is glad the waiting is over. He walked to the cabin first. Clara was at the table nursing Ruth when he pushed through the door. She looked up and read his face before he spoke. Get the girls into the back room, he said. Close the door. Don't come out unless I call you. She was already moving. How many? 8. Franklin is with them. There are men wearing badges. She stopped. Ruth made a protesting sound at the interruption. The law. Marshal Gideon Holt, I think. I have seen him from a distance before. Wade. She had Ruth against her shoulder now, and she was looking at him with something in her eyes that was not quite fear and not quite resignation, but existed somewhere between them. If they have a legal warrant, then I will not fight a legal warrant. And what happens to us if they take you? He crossed to her in 2 strides. He was not a man who made declarations easily. He had spent years teaching himself that the distance between people was manageable, even preferable, and that declarations were the kind of thing that created expectations he was not confident he could meet. But she was standing in front of him with the baby on her shoulder and the truth of what was at stake in her eyes, and this was not a moment for the kind of caution that belonged to ordinary times. "I will not let them take you back to those people," he said. "I will not do that." She held his gaze. "Don't get yourself killed over us." "I don't plan to." "That is not the same as promising you won't." He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned and went back outside. He stood in the center of the yard with his rifle held down at his side, not raised, not threatening, but visible, and waited. The riders came in from the south and stopped about 20 feet from the porch. Wade recognized Franklin Hargrove immediately, same rigid posture, same cold economy of expression, but today there was something else in his face. Satisfaction. The look of a man who has spent 3 weeks arranging things and is now watching them fall into place. Beside Franklin on a gray horse sat a man in his middle 50s with a thick gray beard and the particular stillness of someone who has been doing a difficult job for a long time and has stopped being surprised by any of it. He wore a marshal's badge, and he sat his horse the way men who spend their lives in the saddle sit without thinking about it. Marshal Gideon Holt, as Wade had expected. The marshal dismounted. One hand rested on the revolver at his hip, not gripping it, just resting. He walked toward Wade with measured steps and stopped at a distance that was close enough for conversation and far enough for prudence. "Wade Harrison," he said. "That's right. I am Marshal Gideon Holt, Territorial Law. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of unlawful detention and kidnapping of Clara Hargrove, widow of Arthur Hargrove, and the unauthorized removal of said widow's minor children from the custody of her lawful family guardians." The words came out in the flat cadence of official language shaped by the bureaucratic machinery that had put them together. But underneath the language was something that even the official cadence could not completely obscure: the specific wrongness of a warrant built on the wrong version of events. "The charges are false," Wade said. "That is for a judge to determine. The woman came to this property on her own 2 feet after her husband's family attempted to kill her. She is not being held. She is here because this is the safest place available to her." Wade looked directly at Franklin Hargrove, who was still on his horse watching. "I found her tied to a fence post on the property line in the middle of the night with 2 newborn children dying at her feet. The family you are here to return her to is the family that put her there." One of the deputies shifted in his saddle. Holt's expression had not changed, but something had moved behind his eyes. He looked at Franklin. Franklin's voice was smooth, prepared, practiced. "Clara was in a state of acute grief and postpartum distress following Arthur's death. She left the house during the night in a state of confusion. When this man found her, she was indeed in difficulty, but the circumstances were the result of her own actions in an unstable mental condition, not of anything done by our family. We have been trying to find her for 3 weeks. We are concerned for her well-being." It was a good speech, practiced enough that the seams did not show. "She has scars on her wrists from the rope," Wade said. He kept his voice level. "Deep ones. She did not put them there herself. Self-inflicted injury is not uncommon in cases of postpartum. The rope was still attached to the fence post when I cut it off her." Silence. Holt looked at Franklin again. Franklin's jaw had tightened slightly, the first small fracture in the smooth surface. "Marshal," the voice came from the porch. Every head turned. Clara stood in the cabin doorway. She had not gone to the back room. She had not followed his instruction, and in the second it took him to register this, he also registered everything else about the way she was standing. Grace on her left arm, Ruth on her right, her spine straight, her chin level, her expression, the expression of someone who has decided that this is the moment they are done being managed by other people's versions of their own story. She came down the porch steps. She walked across the frozen yard and stopped 10 feet from Marshal Holt, and she looked at him with those pale gray eyes, and she said in a voice that was absolutely clear, "My name is Clara Bennett. I was married to Arthur Hargrove under a legal contract of marriage, the original documentation of which is in the possession of Dorothy Ellis in Millhaven, along with a deed to property transferred into my name by Arthur Hargrove before his death, and a signed statement acknowledging the legitimacy of our marriage contract." The marshal did not speak. "I am standing in front of you of my own free will," Clara continued. "I have not been held here against my will at any point. This man found me dying. He brought my children and me to safety. He has housed and fed us and protected us from the family that left us to die. She held Marshal Holt's gaze without looking away. I am asking you as a representative of territorial law to hear the true account of what was done to me before you execute a warrant built on the false account of the men who did it. The yard was very quiet. One of the deputies had dismounted. He was standing a few feet away, and he was looking at Clara's wrists, at the scars there, visible even from where he stood. Lord Almighty, he said under his breath. Franklin Hargrove moved his horse forward. Clara, this is not... I know what this is. She turned her face toward him, and for the first time since Wade had known her, what was in her face was not carefully managed. It was simply true. I know exactly what this is, Franklin. You need me gone. You need those girls to have no claim on Arthur's estate. You need the debts he left behind to stay hidden and the land to stay whole. She looked back at the marshal. I am not confused or unstable or in distress. I am a woman who knows what happened to her and is telling the truth about it. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Franklin. Then he looked back at the scars on her wrists. Mr. Hargrove, he said, I am going to need you and your men to return to town. Franklin's face went the color of old brick. Marshal, I have a warrant, which I issued based on testimony I am now finding reason to question. Holt's voice had not changed in volume, but had changed in something else. The patience in it was gone. What was left was harder. Mrs. Hargrove has made serious allegations. There is physical evidence visible that supports her account. I will need to investigate before I proceed further. This is outrageous. She is a widow under family. She is a grown woman making a clear and coherent statement about crimes committed against her, and if those allegations have merit, you will be answering to this court, not the other way around. He turned to his deputies. Henderson, ride out to the Hargrove property and check the north fence line near the tree stand. Look for a post with rope marks and evidence of blood. Franklin went very still. It was a small stillness, easily missed. But Wade saw it, and he understood that what had just happened was not the end of something, but the beginning of a different and more complicated thing. The first move in a longer game that was going to require patience and preparation and the kind of support that he did not yet know if he could assemble. This is not finished, Franklin said. The smoothness was gone from his voice now. What was underneath it was something rawer and less controlled. No, Wade said, but neither are we. Franklin wheeled his horse. The other men followed. Marshal Holt remained a moment longer, his eyes moving between Wade and Clara with an expression that had shifted from official to something more human. I will need statements from both of you, he said, within the week. We will give them, Clara said. He tipped his hat. He rode south. The sound of hooves faded and then was gone, and the yard went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when something large and dangerous has just passed through them without detonating. Wade looked at Clara. She was still standing in the center of the yard with a baby on each arm, and the composure that had held her upright through the entire encounter was still holding, but only barely. He could see the edges of it straining. You were supposed to go to the back room, he said. I know. I told you to stay inside. I know that too. She looked at him. But I have been inside for 3 weeks, and I have let other people speak for me my entire life. And I decided today was the last time. She shifted Grace on her arm. Was I wrong? He looked at her standing there with her children and her scars and her absolute refusal to be managed by anyone's version of her story but her own. No, he said, you were not wrong. She exhaled. The composure bent but did not break. I'm very tired, she said. I know. And my arms are going to give out if I hold both of them much longer. He stepped forward and took Ruth with the ease that had developed over the past weeks, and they walked back to the cabin side by side, and Billy held the door open for them from the inside where he had been watching through the window, and the four of them went in out of the cold. That night, after the girls were settled and Billy had gone to bed, Clara sat across from Wade at the table in the firelight and said something she had been turning over for a long time. I want to fight this properly, she said. I want to contact the lawyer. I want to give the statements. I want to stand up in front of a judge and say what happened with evidence and let the court decide. That will take time, and it will be difficult. I know. And whatever they have planned next will be worse than today. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. But I am tired of surviving. I want to actually win. Wade looked at the fire, then he looked at her. He thought about Dorothy Ellis and the documents in his coat pocket. He thought about the deputy who had gone pale at the sight of her scars. He thought about the specific look that had passed across Marshall Holt's face when Franklin Hargrove had tried to speak over her. "Then we win," he said. She nodded once, not with relief, with resolve. "Together," she said. He met her eyes. "Together," he agreed. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and somewhere south of the ranch on a road that ran through the pine trees toward Millhaven, and beyond, a man named Franklin Hargrove was riding with his plans in disarray and his fears running considerably hotter than they had been that morning. But in the cabin, the fire was burning steadily, and the children were asleep, and two people who had started out as strangers were learning the particular geography of trusting someone, which is not dramatic most of the time and does not arrive with ceremony. It arrives in small increments, a door left unlocked, a word spoken that you meant a choice to stay, when leaving would have been easier. It had been arriving here for 3 weeks, and it was not finished arriving yet. Elias Porter arrived on a Thursday. He came on horseback rather than by wagon, which told Wade something about him before he had dismounted. A man who rides when he could ride in comfort is either poor or practical, and Porter's coat and boots were not the clothes of a poor man. He was somewhere in his late 40s, lean in the way of men who have been working too hard for too long to carry anything unnecessary, with a face that had been shaped by courtrooms rather than weather, but had the same quality that weather-shaped faces have, the look of something that has been tested repeatedly and has stopped worrying about the tests. He shook Wade's hand in the yard and looked at the cabin and the mountains behind it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Dorothy Ellis speaks highly of you." "She speaks highly of herself as well," Wade said. "She has earned the right." Porter almost smiled. "That is exactly the kind of answer that makes me think we are going to get along." They went inside. Clara had set the table with coffee and what she had managed to produce from their limited stores, which was not much, but was presented with the kind of quiet dignity that did not apologize for what it could not offer. Porter sat down and looked at Clara, and looked at the girls in their crate, and looked at Billy, who was sitting in the corner, pretending to do schoolwork and very obviously listening to everything. "Tell me from the beginning," Porter said. "Leave nothing out." Clara told him. It took the better part of 2 hours. Porter did not interrupt. He made notes in a small leather-bound book and with a pencil that he sharpened twice during the telling, and he asked 4 questions, all of which were precise and specific, and told Wade that the man already understood the shape of the case and was filling in the particular details that would matter in a courtroom. When Clara finished, Porter looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked up. "The documents Dorothy Ellis has in her possession," he said. "The deed, the letter, the signed statement. Those are the foundation. Without them, this is your word against theirs, and the Hargroves have the advantage of money and local reputation. With them, we have something different." "What do we have with them?" Clara asked. "We have evidence that Arthur Hargrove himself anticipated this situation and took steps to protect you before he died. That changes the narrative from a family dispute over guardianship into something considerably more serious." Porter tapped his pencil on the table. "It suggests that Arthur knew his family would move against you and that he tried to prevent it, which means the actions Franklin took were not a family making hard decisions in difficult circumstances. They were a deliberate circumvention of a dead man's final intentions toward his wife and children." "Will that be enough?" Wade asked. "The scars on her wrists and a deputy who rode out to the fence posts and found exactly what she said he would find are enough to establish the criminal charges. The documents are enough to establish the civil claim." He looked at them both. "What we need now is testimony, people who can speak to what they saw and heard. The midwife who delivered the girls, Dorothy Ellis, anyone else who witnessed anything relevant. The shopkeeper in Millhaven saw me load supplies, consistent with housing additional people," Wade said. "He also saw Franklin Hargrove asking questions about my ranch." "Good. That establishes consciousness of guilt on Hargrove's part." Porter made a note. "And the boy." Billy looked up from his schoolwork. Porter looked at him steadily. "You were here when the riders came. You saw things." "I saw 2 of Franklin Hargrove's men watching this ranch from the tree line 3 days before they came with the marshal," Billy said. His voice was level and direct, the voice of someone who has not yet learned to be nervous about speaking truth in front of authority. "I know their faces. I could identify them." Porter studied him. "How old are you?" 8. "A child's testimony is admissible in territorial court if the child can demonstrate understanding of the difference between truth and falsehood and the capacity to remember and accurately report what was observed." He looked at Billy for a long moment. "I have no doubt about either of those things in your case." Billy went back to his schoolwork with the expression of someone who has been told what he already knew. There will be a hearing first, Porter said, before any trial. The criminal charges against Franklin Hargrove and the civil claim on the estate will be heard separately, but they will inform each other. I will file the civil documentation with the territorial court this week and request that the criminal investigation currently underway be formally connected to it. He looked at Clara. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you remain here. Do not go to Millhaven if it can be avoided. Do not engage with anyone connected to the Hargrove family. What about their attempts to have Wade arrested? Clara asked. The warrant has been suspended pending investigation. Holt is a fair man, whatever else you can say about him. He will not push an arrest he does not believe is supported by the evidence, and the evidence is moving very clearly in the wrong direction for the Hargroves. Porter closed his notebook. They will try something else. I do not know yet what it will be, but I know they will try. He stood to go. Wade walked him to his horse. In the yard, Porter paused and looked at the cabin. How long has she been here? Just over 3 weeks. The lawyer looked at him. You know what they are going to say at the hearing, that you had a personal interest, that the protection you offered was not disinterested. They are going to try to paint this as something other than what it is. Let them try. I am not saying it to discourage you. I am saying it so you are prepared. Porter put his foot in the stirrup. Whatever this is or becomes, it will be examined and questioned in open court. You should both understand that. Wade looked at the cabin window. He could see Clara moving inside the quiet efficiency of her, the particular shape of the life she had built all inside the weeks she had been here. We understand it, he said. Porter nodded once and rode south. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in early April. The snow had been gone for 2 weeks by then, and spring had arrived in the grudging way of high country spring, not warm exactly, but no longer actively hostile. The grass was beginning to show under the brown of the winter kill, pale and tentative, and the horses were moving differently in the pasture, with something in their step that the cold months had taken away, and the turning season was returning. The night before the hearing, Wade and Clara sat on the porch after the children were asleep. This had become a habit over the past 2 weeks, as the evenings had grown long enough and mild enough to make it possible. They would sit after the girls were settled and Billy had gone to his cot, and they would talk or not talk, and the specific quality of that time had become the part of the day he found himself moving toward without consciously choosing to. He had been thinking about what Porter had said, about what would be examined in court, about the question of his interest and what it was and what it meant, and whether any of that was something he was ready to put into words. Are you frightened? He asked her. She considered this with the honesty she brought to everything. Not of the hearing. I know what the truth is, and I know how to say it. What frightens me is the period after. The period after, whether we win or lose, there is a period after. And I have been living inside this particular set of circumstances for so long that I have not allowed myself to think very clearly about what comes next. She was looking at the mountains, which were outlined in the last light of the evening, dark against a sky that was going from blue to something deeper. If we win the civil case, I have a small piece of land and a modest sum. Enough to start somewhere new. If we win the criminal case, the Hargroves lose their ability to threaten me. But both of those things are ends of thing, not beginnings. He was quiet. Where would you go? He asked. I don't know yet. You don't have to go anywhere. She turned her head and looked at him. She had her hands folded in her lap, and the evening light was doing something to her face that made the tiredness in it visible, and also something else that was not tiredness. You keep saying that, she said. I keep meaning it. Wade. She said his name the way she sometimes did, with something in it that was half question and half statement. What are you saying exactly? He was not a man who said things by slow approach. He had never learned the technique of building toward a declaration by degrees. He could sit with silence for hours, and he could work beside a person for weeks and let the work speak. But when the moment came that required words, the only thing he knew how to do was say the true thing directly. I am saying that 3 weeks ago I had a ranch and a boy and a life that was functional and empty in equal measure, he said. And now I have a ranch and a boy and 2 girls who are apparently going to grow up with opinions about everything, if the rate at which they are developing opinions about being hungry is any indication, and I have you. And the emptiness is gone. He looked at her. I did not know how loud it was until it stopped. Clara was very still. I am not asking you to stay because it is convenient, he continued. I am not asking because of the hearing or the legal strategy or any calculation about what looks best in front of a judge. I am asking because every morning I wake up in that cabin and the first thing I am aware of is whether Grace slept through or not and whether you left the coffee pot on and whether Billy remembered to feed the horses. He paused. I did not know I was waiting for that, but I was. She looked at him for a long time. The evening had gone dark enough that the details of her expression were hard to read, but her eyes were bright and she had not looked away. I wrote a letter to a man I did not know, she said finally, and rode 2,000 miles for a life I could not see yet. And I ended up here, which was nothing like what I planned. She was quiet for a moment. But I have learned something in the past weeks about the difference between a life that is planned and a life that is true. And this one, whatever it is and however it arrived, is the truest thing I have ever been inside of. Is that a yes? The corner of her mouth moved. You have not technically asked me a question. He shifted in his chair to face her. Clara Bennett, will you stay? She looked at him. Her expression did the thing it did sometimes, opened fully without the careful management. And what was in it was something he recognized because it matched something in himself that had been nameless for years and was not nameless anymore. Yes, she said, I will stay. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Her fingers closed around his without hesitation, and they sat like that on the porch with the mountains dark above them and the first stars appearing in the high, clear sky and the sounds of the sleeping children drifting through the window. And he thought that if the hearing tomorrow went badly, and they lost everything they had been working towards, this moment had already been worth everything it had cost. He did not say that, but he held her hand tighter and she held his, and the night deepened around them. The courtroom in Millhaven was not a courtroom in the proper sense. It was a large room at the back of the territorial marshal's office that had been arranged with chairs and a table at the front and benches for observers, and it had the look of a space that did most of its work as a storage room and only occasionally remembered its judicial function. On the morning of the hearing, it was full. Wade had not expected that. He had expected Dorothy Ellis and the midwife, and perhaps the shopkeeper and a few people who had heard something and were curious. What he found when they arrived was a room with every seat occupied and people standing along the walls, the particular population of a frontier town that has been waiting for an important thing to happen and has decided collectively that it wants to witness it. Among the arrivals were James Cooper and his wife Martha, neighbors from a ranch 3 miles east, who had come without invitation and brought food for afterward. Martha Cooper was a large, cheerful woman who had taken one look at the basket carrying Grace and Ruth and installed herself as their guardian for the duration of the proceedings without asking anyone's permission. The Hargroves were already inside. Franklin sat on the left side of the room with 3 other men and 2 lawyers in city suits who had the practiced stillness of people who charge by the hour and are very comfortable in places like this. He did not look at Clara when she came in. He looked at the space slightly to the left of where she was, which was a more sophisticated form of dismissal than looking at the floor. Judge Henry Albright was a man in his 60s who had the look of someone who had heard every version of every story that human beings are capable of generating and had stopped being surprised by any of them. He sat at the front table with his hands folded and waited for the room to settle, and when it did not settle fast enough, he made a sound that was not quite a word and was entirely sufficient. The room settled. Porter stood first. He laid out the civil case with the precision of a man who has organized his thoughts so thoroughly that speaking them aloud requires nothing more than following the path he has already constructed. He presented the documents Dorothy Ellis had brought forward: the marriage contract, the deed to the parcel of land, Arthur Hargrove's signed statement. He presented the physical evidence Marshal Holt had gathered at the north fence line: the post, the rope, the dark stains in the wood grain that the marshal's written report described without embellishment or editorial. He called the midwife who testified to the condition Clara had been in when she delivered the girls, the prematurity of the birth, the clear medical judgment that moving a woman in that condition within days of delivery in winter conditions was contraindicated and potentially lethal. She was a small woman in her 60s who spoke in the measured cadence of someone who has spent her life being the most competent person in a room during the worst moments of other people's lives, and she gave her testimony without drama and without the slightest indication that she was interested in anyone's opinion of it. She was followed by the shopkeeper who described Franklin Hargrove's inquiries about Wade's ranch in terms that were precise and damning in their precision, describing not just what was asked, but the manner of asking, the calculation behind it. Then Porter called Clara. She walked to the front of the room and sat in the chair beside the judge's table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Elias Porter with those clear gray eyes, and she told the truth. She had told it before in fragments and portions in the privacy of the cabin, and in Porter's careful note-taking, and in the statement she had given to Marshall Holt. But she had not told it like this in front of a room full of people with Franklin Hargrove 10 feet away and his lawyers watching her for the first sign of inconsistency or weakness. She told it without weakness. She told it from the beginning: the letter, the train, the arrival, the marriage that was cold but functional, the pregnancy, the twins, Arthur's death, the letter from Franklin the night they came for her. She told it in the same flat, precise voice she used when she was most serious, the voice that had no drama in it because it did not need any. The events themselves contained everything necessary. When she described the rope, she rolled back her sleeve. The scar tissue on her wrist was still visible, pink against pale skin. She held both arms up without theatrics, just making the fact available to the room, and then she set them back in her lap. The room was very quiet. The Hargrove lawyers cross-examined her for 40 minutes, and they were good at what they did. They suggested confusion, grief, instability. They questioned her memory. They implied without stating directly that a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger she had never met was perhaps not the most reliable narrator of her own experience. Clara answered every question. She answered with specificity. She did not grow flustered or defensive or tearful, and when one of the lawyers suggested that the marks on her wrist might have been self-inflicted during a period of postpartum distress, she looked at him with an expression of such complete and composed refusal that the lawyer actually stopped talking for a moment. "The ropes were still attached to the post when Mr. Harrison cut them off me," she said. "Marshall Holt has that rope in evidence. You are welcome to examine the knots." The lawyer sat down. "Marks, the temperature, the state of the marks, the temperature, the state of the infants, the distance from the Hargrove property line." He did not editorialize. He simply described what his eyes had seen, and the description was sufficient. The Hargrove lawyers tried a different approach with him. They concentrated on the nature of his relationship with Clara. They used the word improper twice and the word inappropriate 3 times, and they built toward the suggestion that whatever had happened to Clara, the situation she was currently in, was itself a form of exploitation by a man with a personal interest in keeping her on his property. Wade sat in the chair and looked at the lawyer with the expression he used for weather that was unpleasant but expected. "Mrs. Hargrove is free to leave whenever she chooses," he said. "She has been free to leave since the day she arrived. I have not prevented her from going anywhere. I have offered shelter to a woman whose family tried to kill her. If that is improper, I will accept the characterization." The lawyer pivoted. "And yet she has not left." "No. Why not?" "Because she does not want to leave," Wade said, "which is her choice to make, not yours." The last witness Porter called was Billy Cross. The room shifted when the boy walked to the front. He was in his clean shirt, the one Clara had washed and pressed the night before, and he sat in the chair with the straight back of someone who understands that the way you carry yourself in a room tells people things before you open your mouth. Judge Albright looked at him. "Young man, do you understand what it means to tell the truth in this proceeding?" "Yes, sir." "Can you tell me what it means?" "It means saying what I actually saw and heard, not what I think would be helpful or what somebody told me to say." He looked at the judge steadily. "It means if I don't remember something clearly, I say I don't remember it clearly, instead of guessing." Albright looked at Porter. "Proceed." Porter asked Billy to describe what he had observed in the weeks since Clara's arrival at the ranch. Billy described the events of the day the riders came with the marshal with the specificity of someone who had been watching carefully and had a reliable memory. He described the riders. He described the conversation. He described what the marshal had done and said. Then Porter asked him about the surveillance. 3 days before the riders came, Billy said, "I saw 2 men in the tree line to the north of the property. They were watching the cabin. I watched them for a while before they rode away." He turned and looked directly at the group seated on the left side of the room. He pointed at 2 men among those flanking Franklin Hargrove. Those 2 men, the one in the brown coat and the one with the gray hat. The room moved. The 2 men Billy had identified went very still. Franklin Hargrove's expression, which had been controlled throughout the entire proceeding, did something that Porter later described as the most expensive face he had ever seen a man make in a courtroom. The gray-haired lawyer leaned over and whispered something to Franklin. Franklin did not respond. He was looking at Billy with an expression that contained within it the specific anger of a man watching his own plan identified and named by a source he had not accounted for. He had not accounted for a boy who watched from windows and remembered faces. The Hargrove lawyer's cross-examination of Billy lasted 12 minutes, which was 3 times longer than it should have been, and achieved nothing except to demonstrate by repeated failure that the boy could not be confused or led or pressured into adjusting what he said. He had seen what he had seen. He said what he had seen. He would not say anything else. When it was done, the judge called a recess. The deliberation took the rest of the morning. Wade and Clara sat in the small anteroom off the main hallway with Porter, who drank 3 cups of coffee and said very little. Billy sat beside Clara with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the door. The girls were in Martha Cooper's capable arms in the front row of the courtroom, which Martha had declined to vacate during the recess on the grounds that she had arrived early for a good seat and intended to keep it. Clara was holding Wade's hand. She had taken it when they sat down and had not let go of it in 2 hours, and he had given her his hand the same way he had given her the blankets on the night she arrived, without comment, without calculation. Because it was what was needed, and it was what he had. The documentation was solid, Porter said around the second cup of coffee. The testimony was consistent. The physical evidence is unambiguous. He looked at his cup. But judges are human beings, and human beings are complicated, and I have seen solid cases go wrong before. Is there something you are worried about specifically? Clara asked. No, I am worried in the general way that I am always worried when I care about an outcome. He looked at her. I do not usually care this much about outcomes. It makes me less comfortable than I would prefer. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, for coming, for all of this. He waved it aside in the manner of a man who does not receive gratitude gracefully but is trying. Thank Dorothy Ellis. I was already planning to retire. You are not retiring, she said. No, he agreed. Apparently not. The bailiff came to the door at noon. They filed back into the courtroom. The room had not emptied during the recess. If anything, it was more full, word having apparently spread to the parts of Millhaven that had not been present in the morning session. Judge Albright looked out over the room with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is prepared to deliver it and is not interested in anyone's reaction to it. In the matter of the civil claim filed by Clara Bennett Hargrove, widow of Arthur Hargrove, against the estate of Arthur Hargrove, he said in the measured cadence of formal language, the court finds in favor of the claimant. The deed of property and the terms of the marriage contract as documented are recognized as valid and binding. The claimant's rights to the parcel designated therein are affirmed. Clara's hand tightened around Wade's. In the matter of the criminal charges relating to the events of the night of February 7th and the days immediately preceding, the judge continued, the court finds sufficient cause to hold Franklin Hargrove, Richard Hargrove, and Thomas Hargrove for trial on charges of attempted murder and criminal endangerment. The evidence presented today, including the physical evidence gathered at the property, the testimony of multiple witnesses, and the documentary record, establishes probable cause for each of these charges. He looked at Franklin Hargrove with the cold clarity of a man who has spent a long time looking at human beings who have done bad things and has stopped pretending to be surprised. The court further finds that the warrant previously issued for the arrest of Wade Harrison was issued on the basis of false testimony and is hereby permanently withdrawn. Any record of that warrant will be expunged. He folded his hands. Marshal Holt, please take the defendants into custody. The room erupted. Someone behind Wade made a sound that was part exhale and part something wordless. Franklin Hargrove rose from his chair, and for one moment he seemed as though he might say something or do something, but the 2 men from his own group, who had been identified by Billy, were already being moved toward the door by Holt's deputies, and the gray-haired lawyer had put a hand on Franklin's arm, and whatever Franklin Hargrove had intended to do, he did not do it. Holt himself came to Franklin last. He stood in front of the man for a moment, and there was something in the marshal's face that was not satisfaction and not pity either, but something that had aspects of both. Franklin Hargrove, Holt said, you are under arrest. Franklin went without a struggle. Whatever else he was not a man who made scenes in public. But at the door he stopped. Just for a moment. He looked back at the room and his eyes found the 2 girls in Martha Cooper's arms, small and oblivious in the noise of the crowd. Whatever he felt when he saw them, he kept it to himself. He had not been only a villain. He had been a frightened man who had made choices he could not take back, and now he would carry those choices for a long time. He went through the door. The sound in the room behind him was not cheering. It was more complicated than that. It was the sound of a community revising its understanding of itself, which is not always comfortable even when it is necessary. Wade became aware that Clara had turned into him. Her face was against his shoulder, and she was shaking not with crying, but with the physical release of months of sustained vigilance, the way a structure that has been under load will move when the load is finally removed. He put his arm around her. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. Billy stood beside them with his hands at his sides, and when Wade looked at him, the boy met his eyes with the specific expression he used when something had gone the way it should go. Not triumph, not relief, just a kind of quiet confirmation. "I told you I saw them," Billy said. "You did," Wade said. Porter was shaking hands with someone across the room. Dorothy Ellis had appeared from somewhere and was weeping without embarrassment into a handkerchief. Deputy Henderson was standing near the door with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is deciding whether to apologize. He walked over. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said. He was young, perhaps 25, with a face that had not yet learned to hide what it felt. "I was there that first day when the marshal came to the ranch. I saw the scars, and I did not do anything. I should have." He turned his hat in his hands. "I am sorry for that." Clara looked at him. Her face was still against Wade's shoulder, and she had to turn somewhat to address the deputy, which gave the moment an informality that perhaps made it easier. "What is your name?" she asked. "Henderson, James Henderson." "You rode out to the fence post, Mr. Henderson. You wrote the report that gave the judge the physical evidence." She met his eyes. "You did something." He looked at the floor. "Later than I should have." "Later is not the same as never," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked out. They went back to the ranch in the early afternoon. The road was dry for the first time since November, the rutted track that connected the Harrison property to Millhaven, having shed its winter coat and returned to its normal character, which was not comfortable but was at least honest about what it was. Wade drove the wagon, and Clara sat beside him with the Grace on her lap and Ruth in the basket between them that had served as a portable crib for the past months, and Billy rode behind on the gray horse with the ease of a boy who had learned horses before he had learned most other things. Nobody spoke for a while. The kind of silence that settles after something important has ended is different from ordinary silence. It has weight to it, not the weight of things unsaid, but of things completed, and it requires a certain respect. The mountains were doing what the mountains always did, standing there above the business of human events, with the absolute indifference of things that have been here long enough to find urgency unpersuasive. The grass along the road was green and new, the first real green since October, and the aspens that lined the lower creek had gone full yellow gold in the past week, which in the high country was the color of brief extravagance before the cold came back. "It is beautiful," Clara said. She was not looking at any particular thing. She was looking at all of it. "Yes," Wade said. "I think I had stopped looking at it," she said. "During all of this, I think I had stopped being able to see anything that was not the next thing to be afraid of." He understood that. He had spent years looking at these mountains from the same window and not seeing them, not in the way she meant, not as things that were beautiful rather than simply things that were there. "It gets easier," he said, "seeing it, once you know you are going to be here for a while." She turned and looked at him. In the afternoon light, with the fear finally gone from her face, and the particular quality of relief that is not simply the absence of dread, but the presence of something positive. She looked like herself in a way he had not seen until now, as though the person she actually was had been waiting for the circumstances to make it safe to appear. "I'm going to be here for a while," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said, "you are." Grace made a sound of agreement or protest. It was sometimes difficult to distinguish which, and the horse on the right pulled at the traces and the road went uphill toward the ranch, and the afternoon moved on. He proposed on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after the hearing. He had not planned to do it on a Sunday specifically. He had been working toward it in the way that certain projects are worked toward, which is to say he had been thinking about it constantly for 2 weeks and had been unable to identify the correct moment because every moment seemed either too small for the weight of what he wanted to say or too large for the simplicity of how he wanted to say it. The girls were asleep. Billy had gone to his cot. The fire was burning low because it was April now, and the evenings were not cold enough to require real heat. He went and got the small wooden box from the back of the shelf above the fireplace, the shelf where the books were, where he kept the few things he had saved from the fire. Clara was sitting at the table with a mending project she had been ignoring for the better part of the evening because she was watching the fire instead of the cloth in her hands. He set the box on the table in front of her. She looked at it, then she looked at him. He sat down. "My mother's," he said. "It was in her coat pocket the night of the fire. Her coat was on the hook by the door and the coat survived." He opened the box. Inside on a piece of folded cloth sat a plain gold band, simple and worn and unmistakably real. "I kept it because I did not know what else to do with it. I thought at some point I might know." Clara looked at the ring. She did not reach for it. "I did not plan this well," he said. "I do not have a speech prepared. I have been trying to think of one for 2 weeks and nothing I came up with was true enough." He looked at her. "So the true version is this: I want you to stay. Not because of the legal situation. Not because it is practical. Because you are the first person in years who made me want to be in the same room as another person, and I did not know I had stopped wanting that until you made me want it again." She was very still. "Grace and Ruth are mine in every way that I know how to count," he said. "Billy is mine, and I would like for you to be mine as well by whatever definition we decide to use for that word." He looked at the ring. "I know you came here once under a contract. I am not offering you a contract. I am offering you a choice made freely between two people who know each other now, who have sat on a floor at 4 in the morning and stood in a yard in front of armed men and watched a courtroom decide the shape of their future." He looked at her. "I am asking you to choose this, to choose me." The fire shifted. Outside, the first night, birds were beginning. Clara reached out and picked up the ring from the folded cloth. She turned it in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of the worn gold. She set it back down. "I came here," she said quietly, "in a dress I had worn twice before, and a coat that was too thin for Wyoming winter with a single trunk and a letter of introduction to marry a man whose handwriting I recognized better than his face." She looked at him. That was not a choice. That was a necessity, dressed up as a choice because the alternative was to call it what it was, and I was not ready to do that. She turned her hands over on the table. The scars on her wrist caught the firelight. "This is a choice," she said, "an actual one, made by someone who knows what she is choosing." She looked at him directly. "Yes, Wade Harrison, I will marry you, not because I need to, because I want to." He picked up the ring. He took her left hand carefully with the same care he had learned to apply to the parts of her that had been damaged, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and something in her face was fully open, the last door, the one that had still been closed, even in the best of the weeks between them. He leaned across the table and kissed her. It was quiet and unhurried and had in it the specific quality of something that has been true for a while and is only now being admitted. From behind the door of the back room, in a voice that was approximately 60% convinced of its own drowsiness, came the following: "I knew it. I knew." Clara pulled back and laughed. It was the laugh he had been waiting to hear, the full one, unreserved, and it filled the cabin the way his mother's singing had once filled it, taking up all the space that silence had occupied. "Billy Cross," she said, "you are not asleep." "I am almost asleep," came the dignified response. "Go all the way asleep." A pause. "Congratulations," Billy said. And then apparently he slept. They were married on the first Saturday in May in the parlor of Dorothy Ellis's boarding house, which had been cleared of furniture for the occasion and filled instead with the borrowed chairs of half of Millhaven, which was approximately how many people had decided they would be attending. Neither Wade nor Clara had intended it to be public. They had planned something small themselves: Billy Dorothy Porter and the circuit minister who passed through Millhaven every 6 weeks. But word had a way of traveling in small towns, and a story like theirs had a way of becoming communal property, and by the morning of the wedding, it was clear that the parlor of the boarding house was going to contain significantly more people than had been invited. Dorothy Ellis, who had spent 30 years managing the expectations of boarding house guests, simply borrowed more chairs. Clara wore the blue dress, the same one she had worn to the hearing, the only dress she owned that was not the torn and blood-stained garment she had arrived in. Dorothy had found a piece of cream-colored lace and added it at the collar, and the effect was something that would not have been out of place in a considerably more elegant setting than a frontier boarding house parlor in Wyoming. Wade wore his best shirt, which Clara had washed and pressed, and returned to him with the observation that it was considerably cleaner than the last time she had seen it. He stood at the front of the room and waited, and when Clara came through the doorway on Dorothy Ellis's arm, because there was no father present, and Dorothy had volunteered, and the room turned to look at her, he watched her face move through something. She had expected a small room. She found a large one full of people she recognized and people she did not. All of them turned toward her with expressions that ranged from warm to simply curious. She stood for a moment in the doorway, recalibrating, and then she found Wade's face and walked toward it, and everything else receded to its proper place. Billy stood beside Wade in his clean shirt, which he was wearing for the second time in 3 months of personal record. Grace and Ruth were in Martha Cooper's arms in the front row. Martha had stationed herself there at dawn and declined to move for any reason, and both girls were awake and regarding the proceedings with the focused attention they brought to everything new. Martha beamed at the room with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had decided these children were partly hers and would not be argued out of it. When the minister asked if anyone had objections, Billy raised his hand. The room went quiet. "I don't have an objection," Billy clarified with great dignity. "I just want to say that I knew this was going to happen from the second week, and I think everyone should know that." The room laughed. Not politely, actually laughed the kind that moves through a crowd and changes the temperature of a room, and even the minister was smiling when he regained the floor. Wade looked at Clara. She was looking at him, and the smile on her face was the one that had nothing managed about it, the one he had first seen when she talked about her mother's bread. "You are going to have your hands full with him," she said quietly. "We are going to have our hands full with him," he said. The minister read the words. They spoke their answers. Wade took his mother's ring and placed it on Clara's finger for the second time, and this time it was in front of witnesses and in daylight, and with the full weight of ceremony behind it. And the difference between that and the quiet of the cabin table 3 weeks ago was not in the significance of the act, but in the acknowledgement of it. He kissed his wife. Ruth and Martha Cooper's arms produced a sound of emphatic protest at not being the center of attention, and Grace immediately joined in solidarity, and the minister said something over the noise that was probably traditional and was entirely inaudible, and the room laughed again. Dorothy Ellis was weeping without apology. Marshall Holt, who had arrived sometime during the ceremony and was standing near the back wall, was not weeping, but had the expression of a man who was deciding not to. Elias Porter was shaking hands with anyone within reach and accepting congratulations on behalf of justice generally, which was perhaps broader than his specific role warranted, but seemed appropriate to the moment. The shopkeeper who had warned Wade about the Hargroves all those weeks ago shook his hand at the reception afterward and said without elaboration, "Good." It was the entirety of his contribution to the proceedings, and Wade found it sufficient. Deputy Henderson was there too. He stood to one side during most of the reception eating cake, with the focused attention of someone who is grateful for something to do with his hands. When Wade passed him, Henderson looked up and said, "I put in a request to be assigned to the Northern District." He meant the territory around Millhaven. "I thought it would be good to be in a place where I know what the truth looks like." "It is a good reason," Wade said. "I learned it from watching someone," Henderson said. He did not specify who. He did not need to. They drove home in the early evening with Billy riding ahead and the girls asleep in the basket between them and the mountains going from gold to gray to the specific dark blue they turned when the light was entirely gone from the western sky. The world was very quiet. "What are you thinking?" Claire asked. He considered the question honestly, the way she had taught him to consider things, which was fully and without the defensive habit of abbreviating whatever might be too much. "I am thinking about what my father built," he said. "Not the cabin, the life inside it, the way my mother sang when she worked, and the way he never said much, but you always knew exactly where he stood." He looked at the trail ahead, lit faintly by the rising moon. "I think I understand now what they were building together. I never understood it before because I had never tried to build the same thing." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Are we building that?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "We already are." She took his arm with both of her hands and leaned against his shoulder, and he did not need to look at her to know the expression on her face. He had learned it over months of proximity and shared difficulty and shared quiet, and he carried it now as part of his own permanent inventory, one of the things he knew. Arrived, and within an hour the cabin would light it when they arrived, and within an hour the cabin would be warm, and the girls would need feeding, and Billy would go to his cot and claim immediately to be asleep, while very obviously listening to everything, and the life they had built from a frozen morning and a choice to stop and help would continue in the way that lives, continue without ceremony, without drama, in the daily accumulation of small moments that are themselves the whole of it. He stopped the wagon in the yard. He got down and helped Clara down with the sleeping Ruth in her arms, and he took Grace from the basket, and she stirred, but did not wake, and Billy took the horse to the barn with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this for 2 years and sees no reason to make a production of it. Wade held his daughter against his chest and looked at the cabin. He thought about his father setting each log into place on a summer afternoon in 1867, making something lasting out of what the territory gave him to work with. He thought about his mother pressing seeds into the frozen ground and understanding that what you put into the earth comes back to you. He thought about what he had put into this land and into these years and into the choices made on a frozen morning months ago and what had come back to him. He opened the door. Clara went in ahead of him, already speaking softly to Ruth, and Wade followed and closed the door behind him. And the cabin received them the way a place that has been inhabited and loved receives the people who live in it, with the quiet authority of somewhere that knows it is where it is supposed to be. He crossed to the fireplace and knelt and began building the fire, and he heard Clara behind him settling Ruth into the crate and murmuring something low and even, and he heard the sound of the back room door as Billy went in, and he heard Billy say from behind the door, and in the voice of someone who was not yet asleep but intended to be shortly, "Good night." "Good night," Claire answered. Wade had the fire going. The first small flames were finding their confidence in the hearth, and the warmth was beginning its slow work on the air of the cabin, and the light moved across the walls in the way that firelight has always moved across the walls of places where people come to be safe. He stood up. Clara was beside him. She had come without him hearing her, or perhaps he had simply stopped needing to track her movement to know where she was, the way a man who has lived on a piece of land long enough knows its features without looking. She took his hand. They stood there together looking at the fire. Outside, the night was Wyoming dark. The dark of open country, away from the noise and light of cities, a dark that has depth to it rather than just absence. The mountains were somewhere in that dark standing where they had always stood indifferent, impermanent, and enormous. But in the cabin, the fire was burning. The children were sleeping. And two people who had come to each other by the hardest possible route were standing in the warmth of a place they had made together, holding the specific weight of everything it had taken to arrive here. She had opened the door that had been closed for years, not by forcing it, by being worth the opening. "Wade," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." He had stopped on a frozen morning at the sound of two voices crying in the cold. He had stopped and turned toward them, which was the whole of it. Everything else had followed from that one small choice to stop. "Thank you for calling out," he said. She had not called out exactly. The girls had, but he knew what he meant, and she knew what he meant, and the specifics of it mattered less than the fact of what they were standing in. She leaned up and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the fire burned. And outside the night was deep and cold and full of stars, and the mountains stood where they had always stood. And inside the cabin, the door was open. The air was moving, and every morning that came after was different from every morning that had come before. End of the letter in the frozen road.